much afraid that I'd ventured too much and should be sorry for it. But Emerson says, quote, that what is true for your own private heart is true for others. So I wrote from my own consciousness and observation and hope it may suit someone and at least do no harm. She says that after the proofread, the editor's notes, she cannot recognize her own story, and she also mentions that Emerson has encouraged her to write something that she feels to be true in her heart, and then Louisa says that she has done just that. I love finding this quote because that is almost word to word what happens in Little Woman. In Little Woman, Friedrich encourages Jo to leave the magazine and write something that she is happy and comfortable with. Louisa herself, even when she was in her 20s, didn't put much value to her potboiler stories. Like Jo in the book, she called them trash. But I have read them. They are not terrible. Maybe because she doesn't have respect for the publication where the stories were appearing, she didn't put that much heart into them. Waldo Emerson was Louisa's next-door neighbor and very influential figure in her life. Louisa called Emerson as her Goethe. This is a quote from Alcott scholar Susan Bailey. It is not a secret that Louisa had a girlhood crush on Emerson, and if Bear is based on him, then her affection for him was deep and authentic. Based on my research, Friedrich is a mixed character who is based on several men who Louisa loved and admired. When it comes to Friedrich being Jo's supporter and a mentor figure, when it comes to her writing, that we can trace to Johann Wolfgang Goethe and Waldo Emerson. This is a quote from Megan Armknecht. Emerson was more than just a neighbor. For Louisa, he was her idol. When Anna Alcott married John Pratt, the Emerson family was present. Alcott, then 27, wrote in her journal that Mr. Emerson kissed her, Anna Alcott, and I thought that honor would make even matrimony endurable, for he is the god of my idolatry, and has been for years. Emerson's kindness and friendship towards the Alcott family only deepened Alcott's love for him. She looked to him in everything and regarded his advice as, quote, the best inspiration of my life. When Emerson died, 49-year-old Alcott described him as, quote, the man who has helped me most by his life, his books, his society. I can never tell all he has been to me from the time I was a little girl. When Jo goes to meet Mr. Dashwood for the first time, she actually says that she has a friend who is willing to write these stories for his magazine. Jo is so ashamed of what she's doing, she doesn't even present herself as a writer to the editor, and she uses pseudonyms when writing her stories. Jo is really afraid that the family would find out. She gets really scared, especially when she thinks what Mommy would think about her or what she would say. I think from that you can see how serious it is for Jo, because Mommy is someone who Jo always wants to be honest with, and they could speak about anything. Before Jo has final breakup from the weekly volcano, there is a very important event before that, and that is the symposium. Jo and Friedrich attend a symposium together, and Jo is really excited to go there. But after a while, she begins to see that these people who she has been admiring from distance are just regular people. Her reverence for genius received a severe shock that night, and it took some time to recover that the great creatures were only man and woman after all. In New York, Jo begins to observe people more by their character than their wealth, looks or possession. I know lots of Little Woman fans whose favorite scene in the entire novel is the symposium, and the more I have read it, I think it is the time when Jo actually begins to fall in love with Friedrich. This is where the Christianity comes in. In the symposium, Jo sees one young man starting to speak about atheism and questioning the existence of God. You have to remember that Jo is very religious. Her father is literally a pastor. Jo is blown away by what's happening, and the narrator mentions that her world turned upside down. Jo was quite shocked and upset and didn't know what to think, and then Friedrich started to speak for religion. He blazed up with honest indignation and defended religion with all the eloquence of truth, an eloquence which made his broken English musical and his plain face beautiful. Somehow as he talked, the word got right again. To Jo, the old beliefs that had lasted so long seemed better than the new. God was not a blind force, and immortality was not a pretty fable but a blessed fact. She felt as if she had solid ground under her feet again, and when Mr. Bear paused, out-talked, but not one whit convinced, Jo wanted to clap her hands and thank him. How can anyone not love Friedrich after that? This is also where Friedrich is no longer a German philosopher. he actually becomes an American philosopher, because during this time period there was a rising school of atheism going on in the circle of the German intellects. Friedrich, who is German, is in this case a lot more closer to Louisa May Alcott's transcendentalist worldview and philosophers like Thoreau and Emerson. Louisa was a highly spiritual person. Transcendentalism, it was a bit different compared to the mainstream Christianity of the time, because the transcendentalists were somewhat pantheistic. They believed that nature was the ultimate manifestation of God, and they were also somewhat pacifistic and quite tolerant when it came to other religions. For example, Louisa's father was accused of being Buddhist when Louisa was a child. Louisa was somewhat a spiritual seeker through her life. When it came to romance and love, she saw that the spiritual connection between two people was as important as anything else. That was a big part of Louisa's relationship with Henry Thoreau. This is a quote from Blocher, Skirmish, Wit and Lit. I come back to Thoreau's work a lot when I'm feeling existential. He has such a lovely way of contextualizing complex thoughts about life in his poems. She was properly attracted to his existential musings, and the spark they shared likely came from the intellectual stimulation and being able to talk about life's big questions together. The symposium is 100% connected to Jo's development as a writer. It is all about her starting to put more thoughts on her characters and the messages that she wants to say in her works. The adaptations, they show Jo and Friedrich arguing, which doesn't happen in the novel, but they have never adapted the symposium. What happens is that Friedrich sees a copy of Weekly Volcano, and he expresses his dislike about sensationalism. Jo is a bit upset, but she is not upset with Friedrich. She is upset with herself. Ever since she started to write those potboiler stories, she has had this inner battle about it. She doesn't particularly enjoy the process. The publisher keeps erasing the parts that she likes, and the payment is not that great. Friedrich compares reading sensationalism almost has the same effect as if he would give gunpowder for his nephews. If we take a look at this bit deeper, a couple of years back, maybe you remember, there was a lot of talk about the way giant social media companies had spread false information online before elections in different parts of the world, and also give platforms for hate speech. And they only agreed to censor themselves when the advertisers said that they were going to leave the platform. That is exactly what happened on YouTube a couple of years ago. In the 19th century, that was the way the sensational press was working. Louisa May Alcott, being a transcendentalist, abolitionist, and a promoter of gender equality, would have had very serious moral questions. What are the platforms that she was okay to work with? This is what Jo says to herself. They are trash, and soon be worse than trash if I go on, for each is more sensational than the last. I've gone blindly on hurting myself and other people for the sake of money. Jo stuffed the whole bundle into the stove, nearly setting the chimney afire with the blaze. Yes, that is the best place for such inflammable nonsense. I'd better burn the house down, I suppose, than let other people blow themselves up with my gunpowder. One of the listeners of this podcast said to me that the reason why this chapter is difficult to adapt is because it is really not a conversation between two people. It is mostly a dialogue that happens inside Jo's head. They have a really great point. It is easier to film a conflict between the two than an inner conflict. But the filmmakers never should show Jo and Friedrich arguing because that's not in the book, and Jo 100% agrees with Friedrich. And when you read the book, she actually has this same inner battle about sensationalism and being pressured by money-hungry editors going on at least 2 years before she even meets him. Basically, Friedrich is just saying aloud the things that Jo has been thinking quietly for a very long time. Goethe was Louisa's favorite writer. She had both English and German editions of Goethe's novels, and she even asked her publisher to send her new Goethe editions when they appeared. Louisa loved Sturm und Drang, this ability to really go all in, writing about characters that are constantly in emotional distress because of their turbulent emotions. What she did not love that much was these crimes and murders and scandalous elements that she had to sneak into her stories, when she was working for Frank Leslie. For example, Louisa was an abolitionist, but the stories that sold were actually pro-slavery and promoting race stereotypes. There is an element of Sturm und Drang, stress and thunder tales that actually appear throughout Louisa's published work, and that is the psychology of obsession in relationships. You can see that even in Little Woman, in the way Laurie is pursuing Joe despite the fact that she constantly says no to him, and Charlie pursuing Rose, etc. Another quote from Armknecht. Bear is trying to help Joe to become a genuine writer, instead of one who caters to the whims of the crowd. This is something that Goethe would have done. He disliked superficiality in people and in art, and was through life frequently offended by the shallow pretensions, the false aims. He insists that a poem must be suggested by real life and having herein a firm foundation. So the Sturm und Drang story, it's not necessary by itself scandalous and sensational, because that depends how that story is written. These German Sturm und Drang stories, they are always about individual growth, but these Sturm und Drang stories that Louisa was writing in her 20s, she was asked to erase all the morals. The characters never learned anything, and this would lead into somewhat one-dimensional storylines. That Alcott imposed a knowledge of certain literature on her protagonists, especially Joe, because she, as Joe's living counterpart, was herself acquainted with that same literature. Although still distinct from Alcott, Joe becomes an extension of her philosophies and ideas, is shaped by Alcott's environment and upbringing. In 1933 and 1949 films, Friedrich gives Jo feedback on her writing and tells her that she can do better, and Jo never shouts at him. She appreciates the feedback. In the 1949 film, June Allison's Jo says, quote, "If I can't stand the truth, I am not worth anything." Little Woman fan Jimena tagged this, saying, "Someone please shout this at 2019 Jo." This is how a mature person handles criticism. In both series from 1970s, Jo and Friedrich argue almost the entire time. In the 1978 adaptation, you kinda get the impression that these arguments make Jo a better writer because her articles begin to appear in New York Post and such. It is really difficult to watch because, first of all, Friedrich is not written to be an argumentative person, and second, Jo was always mature enough to handle feedback. In the 1994 film, Friedrich and Jo argue once again. He criticizes sensationalism and then Jo snaps at him, and what I have read analyzes, Jo in this case represents 90s working girl. I love this adaptation for the most parts, but unless if people know the novel really well, they don't necessarily understand Jo's growth as a writer in this film because it is pretty subtle. After this argument, Friedrich apologizes and they go to the opera and kiss passionately. Then the next day Jo has written some kind of pirate novel and Friedrich gives what I always received as a very decent and well put constructive criticism, and Jo gets angry and travels back home, which doesn't make any sense. Then after Beth passes away, Winona Ryder's Jo writes her version of Little Woman, and she is clearly thinking about Friedrich when she is writing it, and she sends him the manuscript. I have heard a lot of people saying that the only thing they remember is Jo and Friedrich arguing, and maybe them making out in the opera. Wouldn't it be better that the film would show Jo herself coming to the conclusion that she doesn't want to work for the magazine? I have problems with the 1994 adaptation, but not as many problems that I have with the 2019 film. In an interview for IndieWire magazine, Heidi Thomas, who wrote the script for the 2017 Little Woman series, said that she never understood why Louisa May Alcott married Jo to a German who disapproved her writings. And because of that, she made him to apologize to Jo. 2017, 2019, and 1994 adaptations, they want to portray Jo as a victim of patriarchy who has the right to write these stories that Jo in the book actually calls trash. It sounds really silly when you hear that aloud. The last episode I made was all about the way the filmmakers romanticize Jo's and Laurie's relationship, and they keep erasing Laurie's personality, and the way he is sometimes really terrible to Jo, and when Laurie proposes Jo, he says he doesn't want her to write anymore. People like Greta Gerwig and Heidi Thomas, they don't want you to like Friedrich. Greta Gerwig said that she is Jo March, that Jo March is her hero, and that she hated that stuffy Professor Bear was giving her scratchy feedback. If Greta Gerwig is Jo, why she doesn't pay any attention to the way Jo feels about writing sensationalism? She was living in a bad society, and imaginary though it was, its influence affected her. There are filmmakers who just don't want you to like Fredrik, so they straight out lie to the public. If you think about the promotion of The Little Woman 2019, Greta Gerwig told to one group that Jo hates marriage and doesn't want to fall in love. In the chapter All Alone in the book, Jo says that she would like to know what romantic love feels like. So that's a straight out lie. Then she tells another group that Jo should be with Laurie, and the third one that Jo should be gay, and her reasoning is that she doesn't think that Fredrik is attractive, and she doesn't like Germans. Greta Gerwig herself is married to a man who is 14 years older, and she herself is a descendant of German immigrants. So all her reasonings are pretty stupid. I've said this before, but the love interests in Louisa's novels are bearded older men because Louisa liked bearded older men. Louisa May Alcott, she actually criticizes the sensational aspect of the entertainment publishing. And Greta Gerwig's Little Woman, the way it was promoted by the director spreading inaccurate information about the events in the novel and the author's life, that was exactly the thing that Louisa was criticizing. And it actually continues throughout the novels. In Jo's Boys, Jo's nephew Demi wants to become a journalist, and Jo is quite harshly against it. I spoke with somebody who said that they really hated the 2019 Fredrik, the way he was mean to Jo, and said that they didn't like her work. This person said that they adored Greta Gerwig, and also they turned out to be a Jo and Laurie shipper. Now we are getting to the source of this problem. Do you see Laurie in this movie trying to prevent Jo from writing, or him saying that he's going to kill himself if Jo doesn't marry him? That all happens in the novel. It is not in this movie. Jo and Fredrik don't argue in the novel, but that is in this movie. I've actually heard quite a few people saying that the feedback scene in the 2019 film made them feel very uncomfortable, because Jo was basically attacking Fredrik without any reason. My friend Jimena, who read the book after seeing the film, was really surprised because there wasn't any kind of confrontation, and she had expected Jo to hate Fredrik based on what Greta Gerwig had said. And then she was surprised that in the book Jo actually seemed to be crazy about him. If these filmmakers really care about Jo that much, why they portray her as this immature person who doesn't want to grow? And if they really are that big fans of the writer, why they keep lying about her? Greta Gerwig even said that we admire Jo because she doesn't want to grow. I for one never admired Jo for being a horrible person who shouts at people who are trying to help her, and I'm genuinely upset if that is how people see Jo as a character because of this film. Another listener of this podcast asked recently, is it even necessary to have this part about the sensational story in the adaptations? Because there are lots of scenes in the book between Jo and Fritz that have never been adapted. I don't think it even needs to be there, especially since it never even follows the story. Having Jo and Fredrik arguing when in the book he is helping her, that doesn't contribute anything to the story. And because the filmmakers do this, they automatically erase Jo's quote as a writer. Together with the 1949 film, the only movie where Jo actually is mature when taking feedback is the modern-day setting Little Woman from 2018. In this version, Fredrik is a university professor of literature, which works in the context of this movie. Jo wants to take herself seriously as a writer, and same way as the book Jo, movie Jo appreciates the feedback she receives. Jo really has anger management problems, but they never argue about her writing. Together with the 1994 film, I think this movie also shows a lot of that intellectual connection that the two have in the novel. In the novel, after Jo has burned the sensational stories, she tries different types of stories. For a while she writes children's stories, then she writes stories that only has moralities in them. Nothing feels as her own, so she decides to keep a creative break. Quote, I don't know anything. I wait till I do before I try again, and meantime sweep mud in the street. If I can't do better, that's honest anyway. Which decision proved that her second tumble down the beanstalk had done her some good. One thing that the Transcendentalists did not approve was if a person lied to themselves. When Jo says that, if I can do better, that is honest anyway. It shows that she needs to feel good about her writing to fully appreciate that. The book Jo is not an immature person who can't handle feedback like the film Jo. She takes her writing career seriously and wants genuinely to become a better writer. When all this happens, Friedrich gives Jo some literary advice. He encourages her to observe people around her, so she can write more well-rounded characters, and as a New Year's gift, he gives Jo a set of Shakespeare's novels. I found another connection between Friedrich and Emerson. For Louisa's 18th birthday, Waldo gave Louisa a copy of Goethe's Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship, and he said to her that hopefully it helps to create interesting and meaningful characters. Next time when you hear someone complaining how Friedrich was terrible to Jo and stopped her from writing, you can freely quote that and prove how wrong they are. When Jo takes Friedrich's advice to study character, she actually begins to study Friedrich without him knowing, and she starts to fall in love with him. Quote, I don't know whether the study of Shakespeare helped her to read character or the natural instinct of a woman for what was honest, brave and strong, but while endowing her imaginary heroes with every perfection under the sun, Jo was discovering a live hero who interested her in spite of many human imperfections. Mr. Bear, in one of their conversations, had advised her to study simple, true and lovely characters whenever she found them, as good training for a writer. Jo took him at his word, for she coolly turned round and studied him, a proceeding which would have much surprised him had he known it, for the worthy professor was very humble in his own conceit. And then followed by my personal favorite quote from Little Woman. Why everybody liked him was what puzzled Jo at first. He was neither rich or great, young, not handsome, in no respect what is called fascinating, imposing or brilliant, and yet he was attractive as a genial fire, and people seemed to gather about him as naturally as about a warm hut. He was poor, yet always appeared to be giving something away, a stranger, yet everyone was his friend, no longer young, but as happy-hearted as a boy, plain and odd, yet his face looked beautiful to many, and his oddities were freely forgiven for his sake. Jo often watched him, trying to discover the charm, and at last decided that it was benevolence which worked the miracle. That is followed by a long paragraph where Jo thinks about his hands and how nice he looks in his homely ragged clothes. It's probably just Louisa writing about Henry. Again, when Jo leaves New York, she and Friedrich are friends. She doesn't go away because she thinks he doesn't like her writing, which happens in 1994 and 2019 films. In the chapters when Jo is in New York, you do get the sense that Friedrich has strong feelings for Jo. After Jo says that she must return home because Beth is ill, there's a scene where Friedrich is alone and he's thinking about Jo, and he wonders what it would be like to be with her. There is some of that in the 1949 movie, where you can see that Friedrich is quite lonely sometimes, and he has longing for her, and in the book Jo starts to fall for Friedrich as well. Quote, he helped her in many ways, proving himself a true friend, and Jo was happy. For a while, her pen lay idle. She was learning beside German and laying foundation for the sensational story of her life. After Beth's death, Jo goes through a period of grief, and then when she is in the attic, she finds a pile of letters that Friedrich has written to her. It is that reminder from him that Jo can be a great, successful writer that sparks the interest for her to start writing again. Then she is surprised when the poem becomes successful, and she doesn't know why, and Mommy says it is because it is genuine, and she wrote it without trying to please everyone. You can see Jo's growth as a writer also in the novel, despite the fact that it is not yet Little Woman that she is writing. Jo is married and she has a family when she eventually writes Little Woman. This happens sometimes between the sequels Little Man and Jo's Boys. I don't think the narrator, Louisa, even mentions the name of Jo's successful book, just that it is a story about her family. Louisa herself wasn't a huge fan of Little Woman, which kinda makes it silly when people complain that Jo in Little Woman doesn't write Little Woman. Little Woman, in a way, is a wish fulfillment. Louisa wanted to marry and have a family. She got sick after the war and never truly recovered. She was very lonely, and then her most popular book was a story about the way she had wished her life to be more like. It is no wonder she had mixed feelings about it. In Jo's Boys there is a quote where Jo says how lucky she is to have a husband like Friedrich who is always supportive about her writing and career. Susan Bailey once wrote in her blog that if Louisa had met a real-life Fredrik later in life, somebody who had accepted her flaws and support her career, she would have married them and be happy. This is a quote from Megan Arknet's essay, Joe Marries Goethe. Professor Bear as the Goethean ideal. Professor Bear and Joe March complement each other, bringing out the best in each other, similar to how Goethe's writings brought out the best in Alcott's intellect. German influence on Alcott and her literary work helps prove that Alcott's books, Little Woman, Little Man, Old-Fashioned Girl, and so on, they are collections of philosophies, ideas and culture which can be used as important tools for understanding 19th century culture and values on both sides of the Atlantic. I hope this episode has given you more in-depth thoughts about both Joe and Fredrik and Louisa as an author. I have become convinced that Louisa planned Joe to marry Fredrik type character even before she began to write Little Woman. In her journals from the time when Louisa was in her early 20s, she actually has a draft of a story which is about her life, and this is like 10 years before she was asked by her publisher to write a book for girls. Louisa said that Little Woman would, quote, write itself. I think it's very possible that Louisa had this idea of Joe and Fredrik and Amy and Laurie way before Little Woman existed. And you can trace both of those love stories to books that Louisa liked to read. But more about them in the season 3 of Small Umbrella in the Rain. Thank you so much for listening. Take care and make good choices. Bye! Bye!